January of 1945 found Dr. Hinrich Becker, head engineer at Herz-Versuchen, Germany's premier arms development center, in a frigid depot on the outskirts of Berlin. Before him, arranged on a sturdy examination table, lay 3 American artillery projectiles, each measuring 105 millimeters, unearthed from the battlefields of the Ardennes. Externally, they appeared unremarkable. Standard high-explosive ordnance, the kind that had been relentlessly pounding German positions for months on end. Yet, these particular shells possessed a crucial distinction. They had been discovered unexploded, nestled within the snow near the town of Bastonia, and the accompanying intelligence dispatches were deeply unsettling. Frontline personnel had reported on a novel American military innovation: artillery rounds that detonated in mid-air with uncanny precision, showering the landscape below with lethal shrapnel. These projectiles rendered fortified positions and trenches obsolete, seemingly possessing an inherent ability to determine the optimal moment for detonation. The reports seemed preposterous. Aerial burst artillery demanded exquisitely timed fuses, meticulously calculated by seasoned artillery crews based on precise measurements of range, altitude, and prevailing weather conditions. Achieving accuracy once was challenging, maintaining it consistently bordered on the miraculous. And to accomplish this feat amidst a fierce blizzard, with severely limited visibility and the chaos of a battlefield, was considered far beyond the capabilities of any military force. Nonetheless, the Americans, it appeared, were achieving this with unfailing regularity. Becker had been summoned to decipher the mechanism behind this phenomenon. As he meticulously began to dismantle the first shell, carefully removing the nose cone to reveal the intricate fuse assembly, Becker was unaware that his discovery would transcend a mere solution to a tactical puzzle. It would unveil a profound truth about the nature of the war Germany was destined to lose. A conflict not solely decided by soldiers and strategies, but by scientific prowess and industrial might on a scale that defied rational comprehension. Becker proceeded methodically, meticulously documenting each stage of the disassembly with photographic records. His hands remained steady, a testament to his resolve despite the inherent danger. Even an inert artillery shell posed a significant risk. A single misstep, an inadvertent trigger, and he could be vaporized, scattered throughout the vast expanse of the warehouse. Upon finally extracting the outer casing of the fuse mechanism, he halted his work. For a prolonged interval, he simply gazed, utterly absorbed. Within the shell's nose resided a device unlike anything he had ever encountered. A compact arrangement of precisely machined components meticulously orchestrated. Initially, it bore a striking resemblance to a miniature radio set, an idea that seemed utterly impossible. Radios were notoriously delicate instruments, requiring careful handling. The concept of incorporating one into an artillery shell, subjected to forces 20,000 times the force of gravity upon firing, was preposterous. Becker beckoned his assistant, Headman Franz Weber, an electrical engineer formerly employed by Telefunken prior to the war. "Franz, come examine this," he instructed. "Tell me what you observe." Weber leaned closer to the table, his eyes widening in astonishment. That appears to be a radio transmitter, a receiver, and what looks like an amplifier circuit." He paused, his voice tinged with uncertainty. "Doctor, this cannot be correct. These components should not survive the stresses of being discharged from a cannon." Becker offered a slow nod. Yet, they did. This shell was fired. The rifling marks on its casing confirm its passage through a barrel. Somehow, impossibly, this radio apparatus has endured the launch and remains fully functional. Over the ensuing hours, Becker and his team meticulously cataloged every individual component. They identified a miniature vacuum tube smaller than any produced in Germany, a novel battery system with an ingenious activation mechanism, an antenna designed to deploy post-firing, and a trigger circuit directly linked to the main explosive charge. As they charted the intricate workings of the system, its purpose became undeniably clear. It was a proximity fuse. The transmitter emitted radio waves, and as the shell neared the ground, the reflected waves would initiate detonation at the optimal altitude for an airburst. No complex calculations were required. No precise timing was necessary. The shell itself determined its moment of explosion. The sheer elegance of the design was breathtaking. However, as an engineer, Becker immediately grasped the implications, and they were profoundly terrifying. Becker sat at his desk, poring over the detailed component analysis. Each element of the American fuse represented a significant engineering triumph. Collectively, they signified a level of technological advancement that lay far beyond Germany's current capabilities. The vacuum tubes presented the initial hurdle. In 1945, German vacuum tubes were comparatively large, fragile devices, demanding careful handling and incapable of withstanding substantial shock. The Americans, it seemed, had managed to miniaturize and fortify them to withstand the brutal forces of an artillery launch. This achievement alone hinted at a manufacturing sophistication that was deeply disquieting. But the situation grew more dire. The battery system was a stroke of genius. It utilized a glass ampule filled with electrolyte. The immense force of firing the shell would shatter this ampule, allowing the liquid to commingle with the battery's components and activate the power source. This ingenious design meant the battery could remain dormant indefinitely without deterioration, only becoming active when required. German engineers had theorized about such a system, but its practical implementation necessitated meticulous glasswork, carefully formulated electrolytes, and quality control standards that German factories, increasingly battered by aerial bombardment and reliant on forced labor, could no longer sustain. Becker convened a meeting with his senior staff. Seated around the table were some of Germany's most experienced weapons engineers. He presented his findings. "Gentlemen," he began, "we are examining a functional, miniaturized radar system engineered to survive firing from an artillery piece. The Americans have surmounted challenges that have vexed us for years. The fundamental question before us is straightforward. Can we replicate this achievement?" The subsequent discussion was somber. Every engineer present recognized the brilliance of the design. Equally, every engineer understood that Germany lacked the capacity to construct it. Dr. Wilhelm Schaefer, a specialist in electronics, shook his head. "The miniaturization alone is beyond our reach. Our vacuum tubes are too large, too fragile. To engineer tubes of this scale while preserving functionality and robustness would demand manufacturing capabilities we simply do not possess." Another engineer pointed to the materials analysis. "The casings are fabricated from premium aluminum alloys. The circuitry employs copper that shows no indication of scarcity or substitution. Every component is manufactured to precise specifications that we can no longer fulfill." Becker made notes, then posed the question that weighed heavily on his mind. "How many of these do you estimate the Americans have produced?" A profound silence descended upon the room. Finally, Hedman Weber spoke. "Based on the reports from the Ardennes, thousands, perhaps tens of thousands. They are employing them as standard ordnance across entire artillery batteries." Becker performed a swift calculation. Each fuse required dozens of precision-manufactured components: vacuum tubes, resistors, capacitors, batteries, antenna assemblies, all produced to exacting standards, all integrated into a device small enough to fit within an artillery shell. And the Americans were producing them in astronomical quantities. "Gentlemen," Becker stated quietly, "we must comprehend the implications of this. The Americans have not merely developed a novel weapon, they have engineered a production system capable of mass manufacturing intricate electronics under the duress of wartime conditions. While we struggle to produce basic ammunition, they are churning out miniature radar sets by the thousands. One of the senior engineers, a man who had dedicated his career to German industry since before the First World War, interjected. "Doctor, with all due respect, I believe you are underestimating the sheer scale of this. If they can mass produce something of this complexity, their industrial capacity far surpasses anything we have conceived." Becker knew the engineer was correct, and this realization prompted him to make an unusual request: access to broader intelligence data concerning American manufacturing output. 3 days later, Becker was seated in a secure conference room surrounded by intelligence reports. What he read confirmed his gravest fears and then surpassed them. The American Fuze program, codenamed VT for variable time, had been colossal. Intelligence indicated it was one of the largest wartime undertakings, rivaling even the atomic bomb project in terms of financial investment. Its development had transpired at Johns Hopkins University's Applied Physics Laboratory, engaging hundreds of scientists and engineers. However, it was the production figures that induced a visceral reaction in Becker. By the latter part of 1944, American factories were manufacturing approximately 40,000 proximity fuses daily. This volume represented more sophisticated electronic components than Germany's entire electronics industry could produce in an entire month. And these were not rudimentary devices. Each was a miniature marvel of engineering, more complex than most radio sets. The fuses were being manufactured across multiple facilities. Western Electric, a telecommunications giant, had reconfigured its production lines for this purpose, as had numerous other electronics manufacturers. The Americans had leveraged their established peacetime industrial infrastructure and their expertise in mass-producing consumer electronics and effectively weaponized it. Becker retrieved German production figures for comparison. In 1944, Germany had produced a total of approximately 40,000 aircraft. The Americans were manufacturing more proximity fuses daily than Germany produced aircraft annually, and these were merely artillery fuses, a fraction of America's overall wartime production. The intelligence reports contained further alarming data. The Americans had initially deployed these fuses in an anti-aircraft capacity in 1943, achieving remarkable success against Japanese aircraft and German V-1 flying bombs. The fuses had been deliberately kept secret from ground combat operations, specifically to prevent Germany from capturing and reverse engineering them. Their deployment during the Battle of the Bulge indicated one of two possibilities. Either the Americans were so desperate that they were willing to risk their classified technology, or they possessed such profound confidence in their industrial superiority that compromise was no longer a significant concern. Becker suspected the latter. This suspicion was corroborated by another document, a British intelligence assessment of American industrial might. The United States was producing more war materials than all other nations combined. Not merely more than Germany, but more than Germany, Great Britain, the Soviet Union, Japan, and Italy combined. The sheer magnitude was incomprehensible. One statistic stood out vividly. In 1944, American industry manufactured over 96,000 aircraft. Germany, with all its celebrated engineering acumen, produced around 40,000. The ratio exceeded 2 to 1. Yet the American aircraft were, on average, larger and more complex. A B-17 bomber, for instance, required more aluminum and man-hours than 3 Messerschmitt Bf-109 fighters. The disparity in material resources was so profound that it rendered tactical and operational skill almost irrelevant. Germany could win every engagement and still face ultimate defeat through simple attrition. Becker realized he was observing the mathematical certainty of Germany's eventual downfall. The proximity fuse was not merely a weapon. It was tangible evidence of an industrial system operating at a level Germany could neither approach nor equal. Becker spent a week meticulously compiling his findings into a comprehensive report. He understood that it would be poorly received. The Nazi regime was notoriously unreceptive to pessimistic analyses, but as a scientist, he felt compelled to present the truth with absolute clarity. His report was structured into distinct sections: a technical analysis of the fuse itself, replete with detailed diagrams and component breakdowns; an assessment of Germany's capacity to replicate the technology, which he concluded was impossible with current resources; and finally, a strategic evaluation of what the fuse's existence revealed about American industrial prowess. The concluding section was the most devastating. Becker wrote, "The VT proximity fuse signifies not merely a tactical advantage, but a fundamental strategic imbalance. The capability to mass-produce intricate electronic devices during wartime points to an industrial base of unprecedented scale and sophistication. If American industry can manufacture 40,000 miniature radar sets daily, concurrently producing aircraft, tanks, vessels, and conventional ordnance in overwhelming quantities, then Germany's material standing is not merely unfavorable, but mathematically insurmountable. No degree of tactical skill or soldierly valor can surmount a production ratio of this magnitude." He concluded with a stark recommendation: Germany should pursue an immediate armistice to prevent further casualties in a conflict that can no longer be won. Becker's commanding officer perused the report with a grim expression. "Hinrich, you are aware this will be perceived as defeatist, perhaps even treasonous." Becker replied, "Should I alter my findings?" knowing the unspoken answer. "No, the report is accurate. I will forward it through the appropriate channels, but you must be prepared. The leadership does not welcome inconvenient truths." The report was subsequently dispatched to the Oberkommando der Wehrmacht, the German High Command. Becker never received an official acknowledgement, but through informal channels, he learned that it had been summarily dismissed as excessively pessimistic and defeatist in nature. One general was reportedly quoted as saying, "This engineer has been demoralized by enemy propaganda. The American fuse is a ruse, a stroke of luck, not an indicator of systematic superiority." Becker was not surprised. He had observed this pattern previously. Intelligence that contradicted Nazi ideology was invariably rejected, regardless of the supporting evidence. The regime had been founded on the premise of German technological and racial supremacy. To concede that America had surpassed Germany in industrial and scientific capability would undermine the entire ideological edifice. Yet Becker knew the truth. He had held the evidence in his hands. He had performed the calculations. Germany was not losing due to inferior soldiers or flawed strategies. Germany was losing because it was engaged in an industrial war against an adversary possessing an overwhelming material advantage, and no amount of sheer willpower or ideological fervor could alter the immutable laws of mathematics. Becker's report may have been disregarded by the High Command, but it did reach some field commanders. One of them, a colonel leading an artillery regiment, requested a meeting with Becker. The colonel, a seasoned veteran of both the Eastern and Western fronts, bore a haunted expression. "Doctor," he stated, "I have read your report concerning the American fuse. I need to know if your conclusions are accurate." Becker affirmed every word. The colonel remained silent for a moment. "My men encountered this weapon during the Bulge. We lost an entire battalion within minutes, not hours, minutes. The survivors recounted shells detonating above them, describing a complete lack of shelter, nowhere to find refuge. At first, Becker replied quietly, I believed they were embellishing, that the extreme stress of combat had distorted their perceptions. They were not exaggerating, Becker confirmed softly. No, they were not. The colonel leaned forward. Doctor, I have been a soldier for 20 years. I have fought in Poland, France, Russia, North Africa, and Italy. I have witnessed every conceivable type of weaponry. But this changes everything. How does one combat an enemy capable of raining explosives upon your head with perfect accuracy, irrespective of weather or visibility? How does one train soldiers to withstand a weapon that renders every defensive position obsolete? Becker possessed no answer, for none existed. The proximity fuse had fundamentally altered the calculus of ground warfare. Centuries-old infantry tactics were suddenly rendered obsolete. The colonel continued, and if what your report asserts about American production is true, if they are manufacturing these by the tens of thousands daily, then every offensive we launch, every defensive stronghold we maintain, will be subjected to this weapon. We will be systematically ground down with no means of effective countermeasure. That is correct, Becker confirmed. The colonel stood, gazing out the window at the ravaged cityscape of Berlin, already bearing the scars of conventional bombing. Then the war is over. Not officially, not yet, but mathematically, strategically, it is concluded. We are merely awaiting the end. After the colonel departed, Becker remained alone in his office. He contemplated the myriad brilliant German engineers and scientists who had developed remarkable weaponry. The V-2 rocket, the Me-262 jet fighter, advanced tanks and submarines, all technical marvels. However, these were marvels produced in limited quantities, often arriving too late, and always insufficient in number. Germany had concentrated on quality and sophistication, while America had mastered quantity and reliability. In an industrial war, quantity possessed its own inherent quality. The proximity fuse was but one instance, yet it represented a larger, undeniable truth. America was not merely producing more armaments, it was also producing superior logistics, more effective training systems, and enhanced everything else, all on a scale that Germany could neither comprehend nor match. Post-war, when production figures were declassified, Becker's estimations proved to be conservative. He had, in fact, underestimated American capabilities. The final production tally for VT proximity fuses surpassed 22 million units. 22 million miniature radar sets, each a sophisticated electronic device, all manufactured within less than 2 years of full-scale production. To provide context, Germany's entire output of all types of fuses for all munitions throughout the war approximated 500 million units. However, these were simple mechanical or timed fuses, not intricate electronic devices. The Americans produced 22 million intelligent fuses while simultaneously manufacturing hundreds of millions of conventional fuses for other ordnance. The cost of the VT fuse program exceeded $1 billion in 1940s currency, comparable to the Manhattan Project. Yet, unlike the atomic bomb, which was deployed only twice, the proximity fuse was utilized in vast quantities and exerted a direct, quantifiable impact on battlefield outcomes. General George Patton, after witnessing the fuse's effects during the Battle of the Bulge, attributed victory in that engagement to its deployment. He later remarked that he considered it one of the 3 most pivotal developments of the war, alongside the atomic bomb and radar. The British, who received substantial quantities of VT fuses through the Lend-Lease program, conducted their own analyses. Their conclusion was that the proximity fuse amplified the effectiveness of anti-aircraft artillery by a factor of 5 and ground artillery by a factor of 3. In essence, each shell equipped with a VT fuse was equivalent to 3 to 5 conventional shells. This force multiplication effect, combined with America's already overwhelming production advantage, created a scenario where German forces were simply submerged under an avalanche of firepower that they could neither counter nor match. Becker survived the war and was subsequently interrogated by American technical intelligence officers. They exhibited particular interest in his 1945 report on the VT fuse. Did you truly conclude, based on your examination of these fuses, that Germany had lost the war? An officer inquired. Becker nodded. Not solely from the fuses themselves, but from what they represented. The capacity to mass-produce intricate electronics under wartime conditions indicated an industrial capability that we could not equal. Every component, every specification demanded resources and manufacturing expertise that Germany lacked. But you were merely examining captured ordnance, the officer pressed. Surely, you could not extrapolate the entire strategic situation from such a limited sample. I could, and I did, Becker responded. When you encounter a single component within your adversary's supply chain, and that component surpasses your most advanced weaponry in sophistication, and it is being produced in quantities exceeding your total output of similar items, the strategic conclusion is inescapable. The American officer made notes. We discovered your report in German archives. It was classified as a defeatist assessment. No action was deemed necessary. Becker smiled bitterly. No. In the Third Reich, an accurate appraisal of material inferiority was considered treason. The prevailing ideology necessitated a belief in German superiority, irrespective of factual evidence. When reality contradicted that conviction, reality itself was disregarded. So you were aware that your report would be ignored? Becker confirmed. I was aware, but I felt compelled to submit it regardless. As a scientist and engineer, I felt compelled to speak about my discovery, regardless of whether anyone was receptive. The experience of Hinrich Becker and the VT fuse serves as a stark illustration of Germany's broader strategic missteps. Time and again, skilled individuals presented accurate evaluations of Germany's declining standing, only to be disregarded or penalized. Admiral Canaris cautioned about America's industrial might and was silenced. Albert Schark recognized that Germany could not prevail in a war of attrition regarding production, but remained quiet. Adolf Galland acknowledged the superiority of American aircraft and was branded a defeatist. Septrick understood the Ardennes offensive would falter due to insufficient fuel and was ignored. Now Becker joined that somber assembly. An engineer who analyzed captured technology arrived at a correct assessment of the strategic landscape, yet was dismissed because that reality clashed with Nazi doctrine. The pattern was unvarying and calamitous. The Nazi regime had been founded on illusions of racial and technological supremacy. When confronted with evidence disproving these myths, the evidence itself was rejected. Preserving ideological purity was deemed more critical than acknowledging strategic realities. This deliberate ignorance extended to the tactical ramifications of the proximity fuse. Even after German forces had been decimated by this weapon during the Battle of the Bulge, even after countless soldiers had perished from airbursts against which they had no defense, the High Command refused to concede that this signaled a fundamental transformation in warfare. Some commanders maintained it was merely a fortunate weapon that German troops would eventually adapt to. Others contended that the reports were exaggerated, suggesting that the stress of combat was leading soldiers to overstate the fuse's effectiveness. The notion that America had developed and deployed a truly groundbreaking weapon in immense quantities was too unsettling to accept. Yet, the soldiers themselves knew. Every German infantryman who survived an artillery bombardment in 1945 learned to dread the American shells that detonated in midair. Foxholes, the fundamental defensive positions that had shielded soldiers since World War I, were now death traps. There was no countermeasure, no tactic, no training that could effectively neutralize the proximity fuse. Becker's report had foreseen this. He had written that the fuse negates the primary method by which infantry survive artillery barrages, thereby creating a combat environment where defensive emplacements offer no sanctuary. He had been precisely correct. What troubled Becker in the post-war years was the stark clarity of the conclusion that should have been evident. The figures were readily available. The evidence was unambiguous. Germany was engaged in an industrial conflict against an adversary possessing overwhelming material superiority, and no degree of tactical acumen could surmount that disparity. The proximity fuse was merely one instance among many. American production figures were accessible through intelligence channels. The United States manufactured over 300,000 aircraft during the war. Germany produced approximately 94,000. American shipbuilding output surpassed that of all other nations combined. The volume of American munitions production was so colossal that allies such as Great Britain and the Soviet Union received American armaments even as U.S. forces were engaged on multiple fronts. The calculations were stark and inescapable. Germany was outmanned, outproduced, and increasingly outmatched in technological capability. The advanced weaponry Germany did manage to produce, such as the Me-262 jet or the Type 21 submarine, arrived too late and in insufficient quantities to have a decisive impact. Meanwhile, America was manufacturing millions of trucks, billions of rounds of ammunition, and, indeed, 22 million proximity fuses. The sheer magnitude of production was so vast that waste was deemed an acceptable consequence. American forces could afford to expend munitions at rates that would have financially crippled the German war economy. Becker had observed this imbalance starkly represented by those 3 captured shells on his examination table. Each one symbolized a triumph of miniaturization, precision engineering, and mass manufacturing. Each one demonstrated that America had achieved an industrial sophistication that Germany could not replicate, and there were millions more where those had originated. The VT proximity fuse stands as one of World War II's most pivotal yet least recognized technological advancements. It preserved thousands of Allied lives, initially by defending naval vessels against aerial assaults, and subsequently by decimating German ground forces at crucial junctures. However, from the German perspective, it represented something more profound. It was a stark revelation of the extent to which they were outmatched. Not outmatched by a minor margin that skill could rectify, but fundamentally and mathematically outmatched by an industrial apparatus operating on a scale they could not hope to approach. Hinrich Becker was among numerous German professionals who grasped this truth and endeavored to convey it. Like the others, his warnings went unheeded. The Nazi regime's unwavering devotion to its mythology of racial and technological superiority rendered it incapable of accepting reality when reality contradicted its ideology. The price of this willful ignorance was catastrophic. The conflict persisted for an additional 4 months following Becker's submission of his report. Hundreds of thousands more perished, millions more were displaced, and German cities were reduced to ruins. All in service of a cause that multiple competent professionals had already determined was mathematically untenable. The lesson transcends the confines of World War II. When ideology assumes precedence over evidence, when loyalty is valued above accuracy, and when inconvenient truths are suppressed rather than confronted, devastating failure becomes an inevitability. Becker's analysis of those 3 artillery shells should have prompted a fundamental reevaluation of Germany's strategic situation. Instead, it was relegated to obscurity and forgotten. The intelligent munitions continued to descend from the sky. The inexorable calculus of defeat proceeded with its relentless computation, and the Third Reich marched towards its foregone conclusion, oblivious to a reality it refused to acknowledge. The proximity fuse irrevocably altered the nature of warfare. Yet, its examination by German engineers illuminated an even more significant truth: the dire consequences of prioritizing ideology over verity, of selecting comforting narratives over uncomfortable quantitative assessments. Ultimately, reality remains indifferent to one's beliefs. The intelligent shells provided irrefutable proof of this principle.